Hey guys, this is Michael out in Salt Lake City. I want to take just a minute to talk to you about something that I think is pretty darned important if you're working on radios. If you do a lot of radios or just one radio, this should matter to you, and especially if you're doing radios for other folks. If you're doing radios to give to other people, or if you're doing radios as a little side job to, supplement your hobby income like I do, or whatever it is you do and where you put radios in someone else's home, I want you to think about using a fuse in the power line to your radio. Now, I get these vintage fuses or vintage-like fuses. These are actually surplus vintage fuses at a cool electronic surplus store that we have here in Salt Lake, a place called Ray Elco, R-A-Elco. And they're pretty neat because they have all kinds of cool stuff. But you don't have to use something like this barrel fuse here. And there are other styles of barrel fuses that work just fine too that aren't quite as vintage. Here's one too. You used to see this kind on instruments a lot. The camera's not focusing too well. Used to see these on instruments. But you can also do, and so of course this kind of fuse requires that you drill a hole to mount the fuse. Now, some people are utterly opposed to drilling holes in their old radios, and I get that. I totally get that. I used to restore vintage cars, and I used to cry every time I'd hear about somebody drilling holes in their 1937 Pontiac. But for me, when we're talking about an old radio, something with high voltage, something that you're maintaining, you're still using a lot of the original vintage components, those components can fail. And if those components fail, and they get hot or they spark or they catch fire, now you really have a problem, especially if you've done this radio for someone else. You really, really want to protect yourself from that. Now, a fuse is not going to be absolute protection against a fire, but it can help. Some people actually put fuses in other circuits within the radio too. I don't do that, but a fuse in the power line is a big deal because if you get a component failure that's going to draw a lot of current, first thing that's going to happen is that power transformer is going to rather suddenly start drawing line current real fast, and that'll take the fuse out. So on a radio like this, I will drill a hole that this fuse would mount in, and I do it really close to where the line goes into the radio. If there's already an existing hole, then I'll use that. Sometimes there are, sometimes there aren't. Usually on Zeniths, I can't find an existing hole, but on some RCAs and GEs and other radios, Philcos, there will be a hole I can use. And then I'll mount this fuse in the radio because this is a fuse then that can be replaced without removing the chassis. So I like that. However, if you think a customer is going to be messing around a lot or using fuses that aren't appropriate or that kind of thing, then you may want to consider putting the fuse underneath the chassis where you have to pull the chassis out to replace the fuse. And that would be a fuse like this guy right here. And these are readily available new. I think Radio Days sells them. You can get them at Mauser. You can get them in other places. I get them at RA Elco. And, I don't have to pay tons for them. Of course, they're still not cheap. And the vintage ones aren't cheap. They know what they have. And I pay for them. But it's worth it to me. So I just want you to think about this, please. Please, there are a lot of things that can go wrong in a radio that will cause a surge in current and could cause a fire. This is one way to help protect the people who you care about that have the radio you worked on. It's also a way to protect the radio and the components in the radio. And it might even protect you from liability if you're doing this professionally in some way. Just a thought, guys. That's all for now.